Continuing on with Aaron Beck and his cognitive model is something that is an important part of the mythology of cognitive behavioral therapy, and that's the cognitive triangle. So basically, the cognitive model really challenges the assumption of subjective experience and suggests that instead of the actual experiences we have in and of themselves, that it's the way we think about the situations that give rise to our emotions. So our emotions are not corresponding with any sort of truth. That really cognitive therapists think that the thoughts we have determine or influence our feelings, which in turn influence our behaviors. So, for instance, individuals who are anxious or depressed tend to display patterns of dysfunction or inaccurate thinking. And the cognitive triangle in CBT suggests that there are three forms of negative thinking that are typical of individuals with either depression or anxiety, namely negative thoughts about the self, the world, and the future. And these kind of core schemas tend to be automatic in the depressed people, and they occur spontaneously. So again, this is just if you were to think about this as a camera, these core negative thoughts about the self, others, and the world are the filter through which you view your experience. And as these three components interact, they can interfere with normal processing, which can lead to challenges in memory, perception, problem solving, and the person can ultimately become obsessive with kind of negative thoughts and with negative emotions and tend to ruminate, as they say. So what's nice about this is that the cognitive triangle is also it doesn't really necessarily matter which piece of the triangle you start with. If you start with the negative thoughts about the self, the negative thoughts about others, the negative thoughts about the world, you can ultimately influence the way you feel about something by changing the way you think about it. So, for instance, if you are feeling like you're not going to be successful and you're in school based on a previous grade, that might make you study less or feel like you're going to fail, and so maybe you won't go to office hours. And ultimately challenging those thoughts by replacing them with something that would be more helpful or more flexible, such as I've been successful in the past, and perhaps with a bit more effort, I will be successful on this test in the future. You can then change your behavior, which is, likely that you would do something differently there. So essentially, the nice thing about cognitive behavior therapy is that you can start with behaviors, you can start with thinking, you can start with feelings, whichever is the easiest or makes the most sense for you to start with. You can intervene at any point to change the whole structure of the triangle. So now we're going to move on to REBT and Albert Ellis. So the mythology within REBT is that people's goals are often blocked by events in life because they have an unconscious or conscious choice of responding with a disturbed or undisturbed thought process. So if their belief system is rational or self-helping, it will include attitudes or philosophies that help them to achieve their goals. Whereas irrational things will lead to feelings of disappointment, sorrow, regret, or frustrations. Rational beliefs also help to encourage healthy behaviors, such as trying to change, improve, or avoid activating events that sabotage their goal. So according to Ellis, there are some common irrational assumptions, some of which are described here in this cartoon. One is the idea that that a person should be thoroughly competent at everything. If you aren't completely competent, then you are no good. The second is that it's catastrophic when things are not the way you want them to be, that you can't stand it and it's terrible. Next is that people have no control over their happiness. Another one is the idea that you need someone stronger than yourself to be dependent upon, that you can't do it on your own, that you need someone to help you. Another one is the idea that your past history greatly influences your present life. So things that have happened in the past determine what's going to happen in the future. And lastly, the idea that there's a perfect solution to human problems, and frankly, it would be a disaster if you don't find it. All of these, he believes, are inherently irrational beliefs about the world. Disputing irrational beliefs, which really is the kind of goal in the process of rational emotive behavior therapy, is first done cognitively. And the way he does this cognitively in REBT is by using scientific questioning and challenging that might uproot people's, as he calls them, musts and demands, his shoulds. For example, why must I, an REBT therapist might say something like, why must I perform well even though it's desirable that I do that? Where is the evidence that you have to treat me considerately, however much I'd like you to do so? So that's just really a kind of rational interrogation of those core irrational beliefs. Disputing is also done emotively. For example, you can use rational emotive imagery, in which people imagine one of the worst failures to achieve their goals, in which they let themselves feel very depressed, and then they work to fully change their inappropriate feeling of depression to the healthy ones of keen disappointment or regret. So you imagine that you fail, and then you let yourself feel very depressed, and then you imagine you fail again, and then you imagine saying to yourself, well, what if I didn't feel completely depressed, or if I just felt something like disappointment or regret? Disputation of these irrational beliefs is also done behaviorally. For example, someone who maybe avoids socializing can force themselves to socialize while they convince themselves that it's not awful, but only convenient to get rejected. So if someone has a fear of speaking in social situations, Ellis would say, go to the nearest department store and go into the center of the store and start reciting Shakespeare as loudly as you can. And that this behavioral thing will help you to realize that while people will give you stares, the earth has not cracked open and you will not fall into it and die. So that would be, the process of disputing these irrational beliefs, which thwart you from achieving your goals in life. And the mythology of the third wave. So we're just going to kind of keep these all here together. So the third wave really reformulates the previous generations of behavioral and cognitive therapy and kind of carries them forward into some of the questions, issues, and domains that had previously not been addressed by behavior therapy, but mostly by things like psychoanalysis, and the hopes of improving both understanding and outcomes. Kind of the key at the heart of this is the idea that many of the emotional defenses individuals use to try to solve their problems actually entangle them into greater suffering. So things like rigid ideas about themselves, black and white thinking, a lack of focus on what is important, desire to completely get rid of negative feelings or sensations. The third wave really suggests that these thoughts, these feelings, and these experiences are merely troublesome, and that fighting against them only serves to create greater distress. These therapies really emphasize the idea of accepting your current experience rather than struggling against it or acting on it. So that might reduce impulsiveness. You think about someone who perhaps has borderline personality disorder. They have a negative interaction with someone they love. The immediate response would be to sort of go and cut. And this is just a way of kind of teaching them some other skills that help them tolerate the distress of having some negative, unpleasant interaction with someone that they love without doing something that's potentially harmful or not a helpful coping strategy. In addition, the third wave is really interested in fostering acceptance, that capacity to pay attention non-judgmentally to the present moment. There's this great emphasis on mindfulness, which helps people to become more aware of their environment through their five senses. An important ritual that is present in the third wave is mindful meditation. So if you've never tried mindful meditation or you're not really sure what it is, mindful meditation is just a way of sitting or of walking or of doing things in the world where you fully acknowledge the thoughts, feelings, and memories you have without needing to fight them or chase them away. You just start to kind of notice them. And in the process of noticing them, you start to get a little bit of emotional distance from them, and you recognize that your mind has its own it's on its own path, it's on its own train, and thoughts come and thoughts go, and really trying to get rid of them is one of the least helpful ways of actually dealing with them. And the paradox of this is that if we try to fight these negative thoughts, ultimately they seem to get bigger. But when we move into acceptance, when we recognize that, oh, there's that thought again, the power of that thought, the thought itself, seems to really get smaller. Moving on to ritual. So there are tons of CBT, DBT, and behavior therapy rituals. Seriously, just Google them. You will find 1,000 of them, and this word cloud shows you some of them. And obviously, I'm not going to talk about all of them, but maybe just describe them generally. I think what's important about CBT techniques and rituals is that they involve work on the part of the client. A very common one that you often have CBT or DBT therapists use is to keep a diary or a log, which can help clients identify either negative automatic thoughts that they might be having, core irrational beliefs, or even negative experiences or negative emotions they might be having if it's perhaps in the DBT tradition. What this process of recording does is it brings awareness on the part of the client to what's going on with them. And eventually they'll start to notice some themes. And that, the themes that emerge are considered the sort of core schematic thoughts that can be opened up to intervention, to either replacement, disputation, or acceptance, depending on what tradition you're working in. Another thing to keep in mind is that CBT rituals are often very experiential. A great example of this would be Albert Ellis. He was very famous for his what he called shame attacking exercises. So, for instance, if you suffer from shyness, you probably have intense fears of looking foolish in front of other people. So he would encourage people to intentionally do something foolish in public to sort of prove to yourself that you can get over it. So maybe something you might do is you could stand up and announce each bus stop on a bus, or shout out the time in a crowded department store. And thinking behind this is really that when you make a fool of yourself on purpose, you discover that the world doesn't really come to an end after all, and then most people really don't care what's going on with you. Again, that core irrational, cognitive distortion of mind reading, where you think everyone is noticing you, everyone is thinking about you, everyone is concerned with what you're saying. And in reality, they probably aren't. And for many people, this can be pretty liberating. A big part of all of these therapies, like I mentioned at the very beginning, is that they tend to be very action-oriented. And for the sake of being action-oriented, it's important really to have goals. And the process of goal setting is just one of the first things that needs to occur in any type of cognitive behavior or behavior therapy. And the reality is that most of us are pretty good at identifying changes that we'd like to see in our lives. However, making these changes is often more difficult than identifying what they are. So, in other words, it's easier said than done. So, goal setting in CBT in this tradition begins with really the identification of broad goals. These are often global. They refer to the broad areas of functioning, family, work, social relationships, etc. And once these broad goals are identified, the therapist and the patient or client then prioritize the goals. And this way they determine what the most central issues are that cause concern, from most important to least important. And in CBT, the counselor and the client will start with a problem that has the best chance of being solved. And they do this intentionally because picking the one that has the best chance of being solved can really help increase the client's commitment to therapy. It also, it's a way of helping get buy-in into the process. And likewise, if one skill is a prerequisite to a subsequent goal, that goal can also be prioritized in treatment. So, for example, you would want to do relaxation before an exposure procedure. You would want to develop an awareness of your thoughts before you do something like thought challenging. So these are sort of scaffolded. Let's see here. Once the goals have been identified and prioritized, they're operationalized, which involves defining the goal and all of the steps that it will take to achieve them in concrete, measurable, cognitive, or behavioral terms. And these steps are reviewed at the beginning of session. They're, every time you meet with your counselor, you discuss what your goals are, and then you reflect on them, as you go along, and you check back in to determine to what extent you have met that goal. And if you've met it, you'll move on to the next one. So some clues that might exist for goals that may need modification would be things like worsening symptoms, if there are no changes in symptoms, if the patient or client fails to complete their homework. In these cases, it would be then important to revisit the initial goals to get feedback about the process of therapy. So asking questions like, what do you find helpful? And again, sometimes you may find that the goals that you guys set would be too ambitious and that thus they need to be modified. So that's often one of the reasons that people like CBT is that it has a very structured approach. Each session starts off the very same way. Client and counselor are on the same page about the goals. There's no ambiguity about that. Again, another ritual. So this would be an REBT. A common ritual is really breaking down an experience that someone has in the world using the ABC model. Really, it should be longer than that. REBT makes use of the ABCDE model in its treatment. So you think about kind of the activating event. Something happens, like you get a poor grade on your test. And in response to that, people have certain beliefs that they have, at the core, these powerful demands or commands, usually expressed as musts, shoulds, or ought tos. I absolutely must have my important goals fulfilled. I must absolutely get an A on this test. And they also often have derivations of these demands. For example, if I don't get an A on this test, it is awful. That is, it's 100% bad. So that is a consequence, is that people sort of, anticipatorily feel bad, or, something doesn't go right. And because it's filtered through this rule and this belief that they absolutely must, they start to feel crappy. Consequences of this is that the person might start to think, I'm a worthless person. That is, that I'm completely bad and completely undeserving. And I'll always fail to get what I want now and in the future. And this consequence is, avoidance, misery, withdraw. If you feel like because you got a C on your exam, that means that you're always going to fail, and you're never going to get into law school, and you're never going to be happy, and you're never going to fall in love, and you're never going to be able to retire, and you're never going to be able to have kids, and you're never going to, feel like your life is a success. You can see how those things start to snowball. So in REBT, once these beliefs are sort of identified through thought logs and thought records, that's when disputation happens. So this would be the process where the therapist in REBT would really start to push around and press on people's irrational beliefs when they are feeling and acting in self-defeating ways, until they ultimately really arrive at effective new beliefs and consequences, a new set of more irrational beliefs. For example, I prefer to succeed and be lovable, but I don't have to do so. Or I'd very much like others to treat me fairly and considerately, but there's no reason why I must do so. An example of this, that when I went to go to the Ellis Center, there's a young woman who whose family was Egyptian, and she was first generation, and she was dating kind of an American boyfriend, and, fighting with her father about it, and just really wanting him to be different, and feeling like my father must accept my American boyfriend. And eventually, I guess she got to this place through disputation with the therapist that the new, more effective belief might be, while it would be nice if my father accepted my American boyfriend, I don't need to have that happen. I'm okay, and I can have a relationship with him and a relationship with my boyfriend still, even if this isn't exactly the way I want it to. So that would be an example of how you could use that activating event, sort of examining the core beliefs that are filtering it, and then disputing and replacing them with something that is potentially more helpful for that person, more flexible, more rational, as Ellis would call it. Another ritual, obviously, is disputation. So this is, again, Ellis, ever the philosopher, really was a big fan of arguing with things rationally, and particularly seeking out alternative explanations, or helping the client, or expecting the client to provide evidence for or against a particular belief in the world. There are a couple of different ways of going about this. You can just do a straightforward technique. For instance, where you might try to substitute a more positive and realistic thought for a negative thought. You could ask yourself, is this negative thought really true? Do I believe it? Is there another way to look at the situation? Another way to do it would be to use the double standard technique. This is where you might talk to yourself in the same compassionate way where you would talk to a good friend who is upset. You'd wonder, well, would I say such harsh things to a friend with a similar problem? And if you wouldn't, why not? And what would you really say with them? Examine the evidence. Instead of assuming that your negative thought is true, maybe you would examine the evidence for it. You would ask yourself, or your counselor would ask you, well, where are the facts and what do they show? Another ritual, this one from Aaron Beck, is the Socratic questioning. I would say in general it's a little gentler than disputation, which is, obviously what Ellis used. I think that Socratic questioning is less presumptuous. Disputation almost seems to imply that you're wrong, which, depending on the client, might not be the best way of going about it. So with Socratic questioning, you would sort of ask yourself questions that lead to the inconsistencies in your negative thoughts. You might ask yourself, when I say that I'm a failure at life, do I mean that I fail at some things some of the times, or all things every single time? And if you say some things some of the time, you can point out that this is true of all human beings. If you say all things all of the time, you can point out this isn't true of anyone, since no one fails at everything all of the time. See how that works? Yeah. And again, the downward arrow. The downward arrow, obviously, is your role play for CBT. And really the purpose of this intervention is a way of moving from the automatic thought to identifying the core schematic or cognitive distorted thought. And there are a couple of ways you can use the downward arrow in your work with clients or your work with yourself. So one way to start it really is to make sure that your client is keeping a thought record. Or if they don't have a thought record, you could just ask them about a recent negative experience they had. And if you were to do this individually, you would think, why would it be upsetting? You would find your negative thought, and then you think, why would it be upsetting to me if this thought were true? What would it mean to me? And that will lead to a new negative thought that'll come to mind. You can write that down and repeat the process several times. And when you review the chain of negative thoughts, you can pinpoint attitudes and beliefs that make you vulnerable to depression and anxiety, perhaps things like perfectionism, achievement issues. A way that you could use the downward arrow for interpersonal issues, or a way of considering interpersonally. If that were, you think of the negative thought and you would say, if that were true, what would it tell me about the type of person he or she is, the type of person I am, the type of relationship we have? So For instance, my mother never listens to me. Um, if that were true, what would that tell me about the type of relationship we have? And then you can keep going and keep going and keep going until you get to that core schematic thought. And then lastly, this one is likely the one you'll use with your demonstration, is the what if. And this is the uncovering technique that was developed specifically for anxiety. So you identify a negative thought that you might have had in your day, either from your memory or from your daily mood log, and then you would ask yourself or your client, what if that were true? What is the worst that could happen? What do I fear the most? And that'll create a new negative thought or fantasy that'll come to mind. And you might write that down underneath the arrow or repeat it out loud. And then you repeat the process several times. And you think, well, okay, what do I fear the most? If that were true, what's the worst that could happen? What would come to mind? And that will generate additional thoughts that will likely lead to the fantasy that frightens you the most. And then you can ask yourself at the end, how likely is it that would happen? And could I live with it if it did? So again, here's your role play for CBT. You use the downward arrow technique that I just described. Ask your client, for a negative thought that they had, and then if that happened, what next? And then you repeat that and you repeat that until you kind of get to that core cognition. And then you want to talk with that person about a way of maybe loosening that up, about finding a more flexible, more helpful core cognition that they could hold. And then you would want to ask them that question really, well, what would it be like to live out this alternative belief? What would it be like if you didn't always have to have the acceptance of people who were in authority? What would it be like to live out the belief that it would be nice to have the acceptance of people of authority, but you don't necessarily need it?